Welcome to episode 1 of Green Future, an eco-friendly podcast. I'm your host, Neil Griffin, and today's topic will be bioethanol. We're going to cover the challenges, the benefits, the production, and really what bioethanol is all about. Let's start with that. What is bioethanol? Well, essentially, bioethanol is a type of fuel, and it's a colorless liquid. It's produced from renewable resources, which is a really nice thing. If you're paying attention in the early 2010s in the United States, it was a really big deal when corn was being grown for bioethanol. It did create some issues with farmers having to change crops in order to make ends meet and also match government subsidies. But before we jump into some of those more social issues, let's take a look at the different generations of bioethanol. The first generation of bioethanol is very similar to what we were doing in the US with corn. This comes from some challenges, or this comes with some challenges, and some of those being land use, water consumption, food scarcity, which we'll cover a little bit more in depth later on. There are some countries that have scaled this out massively, and the biggest standout is Brazil. In Brazil, 20% of their cars run 100% on ethanol, which is absolutely crazy to me. They're also responsible for producing about 80% of the world's bioethanol supply. They're able to do this by growing sugarcane, which we'll talk about later is a fantastic crop for bioethanol. The second generation of bioethanol is one that I really like, and that's utilizing leftovers from crops to make bioethanol. This comes with its own challenge as well. We're seeing a lot of fine-tuning that needs to be done with the actual scientific process in order for it to be sustainable and sufficient. The third generation, perhaps the most interesting, this is where we're getting to something that feels almost like science fiction. Scientists are finding ways of using algae in the production of bioethanol instead of these crops that we've historically used. Much like the second generation, this process requires a lot of fine-tuning on the scientific part in order for it to be efficient. Let's back up for a second. How is bioethanol made? Well, the easiest way to describe it is as a fermentation process. When you take biomass and let it ferment, microorganisms like yeast will break down the sugars, convert them into bioethanol. This makes crops with higher sugar content extremely valuable in that first generation of bioethanol production. Similarly to sugarcane, beetroot is another great crop for producing bioethanol. But when we get into some of these more interesting ways, such as lignocellulosic biomass, which for all my dear listeners is essentially the parts of vegetables that you don't eat. It could be wood chips, it could be grass clippings, it could be the dead leaves that fall from the trees during autumn. It's essentially the plant matter we don't eat. These materials, especially in the world of reduce, reuse, and recycle, have their own challenges with extracting sugars. Now, scientists are being very creative with how they extract these sugars, and most of it comes with pre-treatment of the material before it undergoes that fermentation process. Some methods are steam explosions to release the sugars or using solvents. But as you can kind of see, it becomes more and more of a challenge with more and more hurdles. In my opinion, out of the 3 generations, I think the second generation is the most promising, especially when you consider that food waste that comes from agriculture as well as us as consumers. There's plenty of fuel that can be made. And as a side note, I'd like to say that bioethanol is more than just fuel as well. It's actually the catalyst for a lot of chemicals used in the scientific processes, as well as a primary component in many hand sanitizers. Jumping back into the science part of bioethanol, let's talk about some of those hurdles that scientists have to go through. One issue that really puts a damper on the yield of bioethanol is something called ethanol inhibition. Essentially, it's when those microorganisms produce so much ethanol that it inhibits their ability to make more because they exist in too much of the substance. This is where bioengineering is playing a really important role right now, especially with those first generation of production. Bioengineers are trying to manipulate those genes in the microorganisms, as well as certain crops to kind of get rid of this problem. Another issue is the actual extraction of the bioethanol. By the end of the fermentation process, the bioethanol is mixed with water, which have different evaporation points. So distilling is the typical method for extraction. This distillation process, however, is very energy intensive. So we're facing a dilemma of whether it's worth it or not. So you have a lot of different factors going on here. The fermentation process that needs to be tweaked, the actual extraction process that needs to be tweaked, and even monitoring pH levels all play a real critical role in this sustainable trade. So let's jump to some more of the environmental issues that bioethanol has. The first major issue that pops up, especially with that first generation, is land use, water usage, and deforestation. It doesn't really make sense to approach bioethanol if it's not truthfully sustainable and doesn't really fit into our circular economy ideas if we're just growing food to turn it into fuel. There's also concerns about transportation when it comes to bioethanol, in the form of getting those raw materials to the distillation sites. If the distillation sites are centered in areas that might have smaller populations, that can put a strain on water systems there, or even the transportation infrastructure. As far as carbon dioxide reductions, bioethanol is a much better option than traditional petrol products. With every 10 kilograms of CO2 that's emitted from petrol, 7.3 kilograms are reduced through the use of bioethanol. Many advocates, though, and this is something I want you to pay attention here, many advocates of bioethanol will state that this is a net zero CO2 emitter because of the fact that we grow crops that help purify the air. This is a question I want you to pose to yourself. Does that represent a circular economy? Is bioethanol a bridge that is going to help us get to zero emissions, or is it just a replacement for petrol? Let's jump over to some of the social implications behind bioethanol. Most of these implications come from that first generation yet again. We already talked about briefly how land use is an issue, but let's return our attention to when the United States had a big shift in its corn growing operations. When a crop is being diverted to grow as fuel rather than food, it could mean there's less food available, especially with those stable crops. Corn being one of the most valuable crops in the United States and also used in many, many food products would mean the cost of anything with corn in it would go up. It isn't exactly a sustainable practice if we're starving people in the process. Another big social issue with bioethanol is land grabbing. Essentially, big companies buy out large plots of land for the production of bioethanol. This can displace indigenous communities, and it can disrupt rural communities, not really the direction we want to go for a more sustainable future. Overall, bioethanol is a very complex topic. We could sit here and discuss it forever, but I think it's important to remember that it is not a cure-all solution. Much like anything we deal with in sustainability, there are layers and layers to peel back from the topic to truly understand if it's worth pursuing or not. So before I sign off, I'd like to ask you this. Do you think it's worth it? Thanks for joining me today on the first episode of this podcast. Hopefully there's more to come in the future. I had a pleasure learning about this topic. I'll link all my resources below, and I hope to see you on the next one.